Hi, this is Professor Evans. This video is for the students in COP 1000C, which is Intro to Programming Concepts at Valencia College in Orlando, Florida. In this video, we're going to discuss Unit 8, which covers arrays and strings. So as you work through Unit 8, some of the learning objectives are that you will be able to identify the purpose of arrays, be able to declare and initialize arrays, demonstrate manipulating data into arrays, pass an array as a parameter into a function, demonstrate how to search and sort an array, evaluate range-based for loops, and use strings to input data and output data. So in this video, I'm going to do 3 examples dealing with arrays and strings. So I'm going to begin with my first example here, which is just going to go over the basics of how we use an array. So here's our program objective. We're going to ask the user to enter 10 numbers into an array. Well, the user is going to enter the 10 numbers, and we're going to store them into an array. So I'll say stored into an array. And then calculate sum and average of the numbers entered. So that's our program objective. Our inputs are going to be an array that can hold 10 values. So to declare an array, we have to give it a type like int or double or float that describes the type of data that will be stored into the array. You can think of an array as like a table. It can be a one-dimensional table, which would be like a single row or a single column within a table, or you can have a two-dimensional array, which is going to have both rows and columns. In this case, I just need to store 10 numbers, so I need a one-dimensional array to store those 10 numbers. We can think of a table with 10 rows in it, and each cell is going to hold one value that is entered from the user. So to declare our array, we have to give it a type. In this case, I'm going to call it double. I'm going to give it a name. I'm going to call it numbers. I'm going to use a bracket to indicate that this is an array, and then I'm going to use the number 10 to indicate the size of the array. So this array is going to be able to hold 10 values that are of type double. I'm going to have the sum and the average as my 2 outputs. And now let's talk about our process for accomplishing the program objective. Let's begin by saying that we're going to have to use a loop because we need to collect 10 numbers from the user. So I'm going to use a loop in order to collect those 10 numbers. So use a loop to ask the user repeatedly to enter a number until 10 numbers have been received. We're going to store the numbers into an array, calculate the sum and average, print the sum and average to the screen. So this is going to be our process one step at a time. To begin our program, we have our pound include and our namespace statements. And then our main function, or our main program rather. All right, so we're going to go ahead and declare our array. Sum, I'm going to go ahead and initialize it to 0. And average. So if you look at our process, the first step was to use a loop to ask the user to repeatedly enter a number until 10 numbers have been received. So that's going to be the first thing that I'm going to set up right here. I'm going to use a for loop because I know that I need it to run exactly 10 times. So I'm going to set up my index. And then within my loop, I'm going to ask the user to enter a number. So that the user can keep track of how many numbers they've entered, I'm actually going to print the index of my loop within the cout statement. So what I want the screen to say is enter number 1, enter number 2, enter number 3 as the user enters each number. That way it's easier for the user to keep track of how many numbers have I entered so far. So keep in mind that our loop is going to go from 0 through 9. It's going to start with an index of 0. But as the user, typically when people think about entering 10 numbers, they think about counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 to count those 10 numbers. So if I were to print out the index of my loop right now, the first time this runs, it's going to say enter number 0. And then the next time it runs, it's going to say enter number 1, and then enter number 2, and so on. Since the user is really going to be thinking about counting from 1 to 10 instead of 0 to 9, I'm just going to add 1 to the index so that every time this prints out, it'll be 1 higher than what the actual index is. Again, that's just for the user to have some familiarity with the data that they're entering. So now this is going to print out enter number 1, enter number 2, enter number 3 as this loop executes. So after we print out the number, I also want to include just a semicolon or a colon rather, so that the user can see that that's the end of the line. And then we're going to read the number from the user and store it in the array. So as I starts out, I will start out with 0, and the array has 10 cells in it, or 10, you could think of it as rows, 10 places to store data. And each cell within your array has an index. The index for an array always begins at index 0. So the very first cell or the very first column within your array is always going to be referenced as index 0. So when I starts out at 0, we're going to get the first number and store it in numbers sub 0, or that very first cell. The index of that very first cell is going to be 0. So when we think about an array, we can think about it in two ways. The size of the array is 10 because there are 10 places or 10 spots or 10 cells within that array that are available to hold data. Every cell has an index, and those indexes are going to go from 0 to 9. And if you count 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, that's 10 digits total. The digits just go from 0 to 9. So we're always going to start I out at 0 and store that very first number within numbers sub 0. And then as I increments, we'll store the next number in numbers sub 1, numbers sub 2, numbers sub 3, and so forth. Until we get up to numbers sub 9, that's the very last cell in our array. All right, so after the user enters a number, I'm going to go ahead and just print out a new line character so that the screen looks clear as the user continues to enter new numbers. Another way to do this actually is to just go ahead and put this here so that every time this prints, it prints on a new line. So I'll do it that way instead. And while we're collecting the numbers, we're going to go ahead and calculate the sum as well, because every time I get a new number, I just need to add it to what I've already calculated. So with each new value that comes in, we're going to add that value to sum. So sum starts out at 0. The very first time this runs, sum is going to be 0 plus whatever the first number is, and then we're going to save that in sum. And then the second time this runs, it's going to take the previous value of sum, add the new number to it, and store that as a new value back into sum. Remember, when we have an expression like this, the right is going to get evaluated first, and that value is going to be stored into what is on the left of the equal sign. So when this executes, whatever sum is currently is going to get a new value added to it, and then that value of sum will be erased by the new value, and it'll be stored right back into sum. So this is our for loop to repeatedly ask the user to enter a number until 10 numbers have been received. And we're storing the numbers into the array right here. This is where we store the numbers into an array. This is where we're calculating the sum. So I can put that there on the side, or if you prefer, you can put it there, however you like. So we calculated the sum, and the next thing we're going to have to do is calculate the average, which we know since there are 10 numbers, we just need to take the sum and divide by 10. The last thing we're going to do is print everything to the screen. So what I'm going to do is first print the list of numbers to the screen, just so that the user can see as a confirmation, okay, here's what was entered. So we're going to have the numbers entered were and now I'm going to set up a for loop where we're going to cycle through the array and print out what's in each index, starting with index 0 and going up to index 9. So we're going to say number sub I right here and print out a space so that each number has some space in between it. So this is going to print out all of the numbers that we've stored into the array. Notice that I don't have any brackets with my for loop because there's only one line that I want to execute within my for loop. So I don't have to have the brackets. Once that for loop completes, we're going to print the sum and average. So I'm going to have two cout statements where I'm just going to state the sum of the numbers was sum, and then add a period. And the average of the numbers was, and then we'll write average. And that's going to end our program. So let's go ahead and check for any errors. Okay, it is running right now. So you can see on the screen it says enter number 1. So remember, we're in this loop right here. There's an index I that begins at 0. So we're going to enter the first number, which as the user, we're thinking that's number 1, but that's going to go into index 0 of my numbers array. So let's say that I just enter the number 10, and then the number 9, the number 8, the number 7, the number 6, the number 5, the number 4, the number 3, 2, and 1. All right, so we can see that the list of numbers entered is right here, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. If you add all those up, you will get a sum of 55. And if you take the average, 55 divided by 10, you'll get 5.5. So we can see here that our loop executed 10 times, allowing us to collect 10 numbers. Those 10 numbers are printed to the screen, and then we get the sum and the average. And that is going to conclude example number 1. All right, so for example number 2, we're going to ask the user to enter, oh, whoops, hold on. This is still example number 1. Just got to change my notes, 1 second. All right, so I went ahead and grabbed the program description for this second example because it's a little bit long. So I copied and pasted it in so that I can just sort of read through it with you. So for this program, we're going to write a program that allows the user to enter the last names of 5 candidates in a local election and the number of votes received for each candidate. The program should then output each candidate's name, the number of votes received, and the percentage of the total votes received by the candidate. Your program should also output the winner of the election. We also have to have 2 functions, a function to determine the sum of votes and a function to output the winner of the election. All right, so our inputs for this program are going to be an array of 5 candidates. And keep in mind that we're taking names, last names only. So we're going to have an array that is going to have type string so that we can store text. And we're going to have that array have a size of 5 because we know we have 5 candidates. And then we're going to have a second array to capture the votes for each candidate. So we have our string candidates, and then we have int votes. And our output is going to be a table that displays each candidate's name, their votes, and the percentage of the total votes received. And then we're going to also display below that the winner of the election. So let's talk about our process here. So the first thing we're going to do is use a loop to collect the candidate names and the votes for each candidate. Then we're going to need to use a function to determine the sum of all votes. And that function is going to look something like this. It's going to return an integer because it's just going to sum all the votes. We're going to call it sum votes. We're going to pass in a list that is an array. This is how we pass in an array as a parameter. And we're also going to pass in the size of the list. So our function declaration is going to look like that. We're also going to use a function to determine the winner of the election. Yeah, I'm going to change this word here also to determine. So our function to determine the winner of the election, you could do this a number of ways. I am going to use this function to tell me the index of the winner, and then I'm going to use that index to print out that winner's name. So in that case, I'm going to return an integer value here. And I'm going to call this winner index so that I remember it's going to tell me the index of the winner. So if I think of my array, which has 5 cells, the index of the winner will be the cell with the largest number of votes. So I'm going to find that cell, and then I'm going to print the name of the person who corresponds to that highest number of votes. So I'm going to call this winner index, and it's also going to take in an integer list and the list size. So when I call these functions, my plan is to pass in my array of votes, and then the function will count all the votes and add them up. With this function, my plan is to pass in, again, the array of votes and have it determine which one had the highest amount, who had the highest amount of votes. And then we're going to print the output table. So I'm going to show you how to do some output formatting today, and we're going to print the winner as well. So that is my process for this code. I'm going to go ahead and close the console right now since we're not using it. And now let's begin our program. So for our pound include statements, we're going to need IOStream. We are going to need IOmanip. And we're going to need string, since we're dealing with strings. All right, so right up here, I'm going to do my 2 function declarations. Remember, your function declarations are going to go before your main. And now I'm ready to start the main program. So I'm going to go ahead and declare those variables. The candidates is going to be a string of size 5. I'm going to have int votes, which is also going to be size 5. I know I need to calculate the sum, so I'm going to call this variable total votes. And I'm going to go ahead and initialize it to 0. I also know that I need to find the index of the winner, so I'm going to create another integer called winner and initialize that to 0. And then I know I'm going to need to calculate the vote percentage for each candidate. So I'm going to create a variable to store that value as well. I'm going to go ahead and set up my output so that I have a precision of 2 decimal places for everything that I print. And now I'm ready to begin implementing the algorithm in my process. So first things first, we're going to use a loop to collect the candidate names and votes. So I'm going to have a loop that looks like this. So I'm going to ask the user, enter candidate. Once again, I'm going to go ahead and display the I+1 here so that the user knows, okay, this is candidate 1, candidate 2, and so on. I'm doing apostrophe S, so it'll say candidate 1's or candidate 2's last name and the votes received for the candidate. All right, here's where I'm going to collect the candidate name first and the vote received into the array. So these 2 arrays are going to be synchronized because the same index is going to be used each time through the loop. So if candidate 1, their last name is Johnson and they get 500 votes, then our first cell in the candidate array will have the name Johnson, and the first cell in the vote array will have the name or have the votes that they received. Let's make sure I use the same names I defined. So I called it candidates and votes. So I want to make sure I have this candidates and votes as well. So that loop is going to collect our information from the user. The next thing we have is to use a function to determine the sum of all votes. All right, so we kind of have an idea of what our function is going to look like in terms of the declaration. Let's go ahead and write the code for this function. So I'm going to just add a little comment. This function will calculate the sum of all votes received. All right, so we have int sum votes. We're going to pass in an array as the first parameter and the array size as the second parameter. Since I have to calculate the sum in this function, I am going to define a local variable called sum. And we're going to set up another loop. Where we're going to go through each cell of the array and grab its value and add it to sum. Oh, and right here, we can use list size instead of 5, and that way if we end up changing the list size later, it doesn't affect our function. We don't have to change the code for our function. Once this for loop is complete, we want to return sum. So back in our main program, when we're ready to use this function, we are going to store the sum in our variable total votes. So we're going to say total votes equals sum votes. Here's where we call our function. We're going to pass in our array and its size. So votes will become list in our array, and 5 will become list size in our array. So there's our total votes. Next, we're going to use a function to determine the winner of the election. So let's write a function for winner index. All right, so this function will determine who had the most votes by comparing each value in the array to the largest previous value found. All right, so I need a variable to store the winner. Remember, we're looking for the index of the largest amount of votes within the array. So I'm going to set up a for loop so that I can search through that array. So here's what we want to do. We want to take a look at each value within our list. So if list sub I is greater than list sub win index, right? So remember, the first time we run this, win index is 0. So we're going to look at the first value in the list. If that value in the list is greater than the value in the list at the 0 index, we're going to change this value to I. So let's say that my list has the numbers 5, 8, 10, 2, 4. So the first time through this loop, when end is 0, and we're going to look at list sub I. List sub I would be list sub 0, this case 5. And then we're going to look at list sub win index. Well, is 5 greater than 5? No, so nothing happens. But the next time through, we're going to look at 8. So we're going to look at 8, and we're going to say, is 8 greater than list win index? Well, win index is still 0. So if we go look at the list in cell 0, that would be the 5. Is 8 bigger than 5? Yes. So now when index gets I, which means it gets the index of the 8. The third time through, it's going to look at the 10, and it's going to compare that to 8 and say, well, 10 is bigger than 8. So the index I'm going to store right here would be 2, because this is index 0, this is index 1, this is index 2. The fourth time through the loop, it's going to compare 2 to 10 and say, well, 2 is not bigger than 10, and so it's going to do nothing. And then the last time through the loop, it's going to compare 4 to 10, and it's going to say, well, 4 is not bigger than 10, and it'll do nothing. And it'll return the index of that largest number, which would be index 3. So that's how this is going to work. So once this for loop is done executing, we're going to return our index for the winner. So if I go back to the main program, I can now call this function and store its output in winner. And that's going to represent the index of the winner in this election. So I'm going to pass in votes and the size into my function for winner. All right, so here's where I'm going to print the output table. So first I'm going to make a header. So we have candidate, votes received, percent of total votes, I'll do it like that, percent of total votes, now what we need to do is walk through our two arrays and print out everything in the arrays, as well as calculate the vote percentage. So first, I'm going to go ahead and calculate the vote percentage after I create a loop to run through each array. So here's the loop. So the first thing I'm going to do is calculate vote percentage. Now keep in mind that we are going to calculate the percentage by looking at the number of votes received divided by the total votes, but both of those are integer values, and we don't want to do integer division here. If I am doing a division the answer is a decimal, I want to see that decimal, so we're going to have to typecast in order to do that, which means we're basically going to have to temporarily convert the integer type of our two values to doubles so that when we divide them, we get a double value for our vote percentage. So here's what that's going to look like. We have static underscore cast, and then we're basically saying I want to take the following value and make it a double. So grab a value from the array, which is by default going to be an integer, and make it a double temporarily just for this calculation. That's what we're saying right here. And then what we're going to do is also static cast our total votes, so that when we do this division here, we have a double divided by a double stored into a double, and we'll get a percentage that we can see on the screen. So right now, the last thing I just have to do is multiply by 100 so that it represents a percentage. And when we print out our table, we're going to see the voter percentage displayed as a decimal, like 50.4% or whatever. All right, so here's how we set up some rows and columns within our table for printing purposes. We can use the word left to left justify or right justify, and then we can use the term set W to determine like a number of blank spaces that are going to print out before the next value prints. So this is going to left justify the mouse, go ahead 10 spaces, and then print out the name of the candidate. Then we're going to add a space, a blank space. And print the votes. A few more spaces. Then we're going to print vote percentage, followed by the percent sign. And an end line. This loop right here is going to calculate the percentage of the votes earned per candidate. So every time vote sub I changes, we'll get a new percentage. And then we're going to print the candidate's name, the number of votes they got, and their vote percentage to the screen all on one line with some spacing in between. That's what this section is doing right here. Once that's finished, we need to print out the winner. I'm sorry, we have to print out the total votes and then the winner. So I'll just put a comment here and print the total votes. So I'm going to write justify, and again, these set W's are just to create some even spacing from one row to the next in your table. When I run this, you'll be able to see what it looks like. So there's my total votes, and print the winner. So to print the winner, I'm going to just display a little message. Now remember, our variable winner has the index of who won. So if index 3 had the highest number of votes, I want to print out the name of the candidate for index 3. So I'm going to pass in that index for the candidates array to get the name to print on the screen. And add a period. That's going to conclude our program. Let's go ahead and check for errors and run. All right, so on line 65, I forgot the W and set W. On line 84, take a look and see if you can find it. All right, so right here you can see that I said I less than 0 instead of equals 0. So that's obviously going to give me an error. Let's check again. And on line 98, I misspelled that variable. All right, so I've debugged my program. I found all my errors. Enter candidate one's last name and the votes received for the candidate. So let's say that the last name for candidate 1 is Johnson and they received 8,000 votes. Let's say that candidate 2 was Smith and that candidate received 3,200 votes. Let's say that the third candidate's name was Gomez and this candidate received 4,532 votes. Let's say that the last candidate, or the fourth candidate, was Jackson Brown, and that candidate had 10,987 votes. And the fifth candidate's name was Powell, and that candidate had 8,764 votes. So there's my table, and here's where you can see the candidate, the votes received, the percent of total votes. We have our percentages here. Jackson Brown is a little bit of a longer name, so it's indented a little bit more. But then we can see our total votes and the winner. If I run this again, let's just say I'll just use letters this time. So candidate A had 23 votes, candidate B had 56 votes, candidate C had 200 votes, candidate D had 201 votes, and candidate E had 157 votes. Now we can see our table again, and so the spacing is from using those left justified and right justified options with the set W and just giving it a number of spaces to include from one piece of information to the next. So that concludes my second example on arrays and strings. That's going to be it for the video this week. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.